The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the convoy of 3 Humvees as they rolled through the dusty streets of Fallujah. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her body armor and checked her weapon for the 10th time that morning. Something felt different about this patrol. The usual chatter on the radio had been replaced by tense, clipped communications, and even the most experienced soldiers in her unit seemed on edge. Maria had been in Iraq for 8 months now, serving as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. At 26, she was one of the few women in her unit who regularly went on patrol missions. Her small stature and quick reflexes had earned her the nickname Mouse among her fellow soldiers, but there was nothing small about her courage or her dedication to keeping her team alive. The intelligence reports that morning had been concerning. Local informants had warned of increased insurgent activity in the area they were patrolling. The mission was supposed to be routine, a sweep through a neighborhood where coalition forces had received reports of weapons caches. But in Fallujah, nothing was ever truly routine. Sergeant First Class David Chen, the patrol leader, came over the radio from the lead vehicle. "Stay sharp, everyone. We're approaching the target area. Intel suggests we might have company today." Maria's Humvee was in the middle of the convoy. She sat in the back with Private Johnson, a 19-year-old kid from Alabama who still looked like he should be in high school, rather than carrying an M4 carbine through one of the most dangerous cities in Iraq. Specialist Williams was driving, while Corporal Martinez manned the gunner position in the turret above them. The neighborhood they entered was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of daily life, children playing, merchants calling out their wares, the hum of generators, were completely absent. Even the stray dogs that typically roamed the streets were nowhere to be seen. The silence was more unsettling than any gunfire Maria had ever heard. "This doesn't feel right," Johnson whispered, his voice tight with nervous energy. Maria nodded, her hand moving instinctively to the medical supplies secured to her vest. In combat, seconds mattered when treating wounded soldiers, and she had trained herself to access her equipment without thinking. Her mind was already running through emergency procedures, hoping she wouldn't need them but ready nonetheless. As they turned onto a narrow street lined with concrete buildings, Maria noticed movement in an upper window. It was just a flash, barely visible, but her training had taught her to trust her instincts. She was about to key her radio when the world exploded around them. The first shot came from a rooftop sniper and struck the windshield of their Humvee. Williams immediately jerked the wheel to the right, trying to get them out of the kill zone. But it was too late. The ambush had been carefully planned, with insurgents positioned in buildings on both sides of the street. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The distinctive crack of AK-47 seconds, mixed with the deeper sound of a machine gun as bullets began striking their vehicle. Martinez returned fire from the turret, his .50 caliber machine gun thundering as he tried to suppress the enemy positions. "Contact! Contact!" Chen's voice crackled over the radio. Multiple shooters in buildings on both sides of the street were taking heavy fire. Maria felt the Humvee lurch as Williams tried to maneuver to better cover. Through her window, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different buildings. The sound of bullets hitting their armored vehicle was like deadly rain, a constant metallic drumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Johnson was pressed against the far door, his rifle ready but his face pale with fear. This was his first real firefight, and Maria could see the shock in his eyes. She had been in similar situations before, but the intensity of this attack was unlike anything she had experienced. "Stay low," she shouted over the noise. "Return fire when you have clear targets." The convoy had stopped moving, trapped in what military tacticians call a kill zone, an area where the enemy has positioned forces to deliver maximum damage. The lead and rear vehicles were also taking heavy fire, and Maria could hear the voices of other soldiers over the radio reporting casualties. Suddenly, their Humvee shuddered as something much larger than bullets struck it. An RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, had exploded against the passenger side, just a few feet from where Maria was sitting. The blast was deafening, and she felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder as shrapnel found its way through a gap in her body armor. Williams slumped over the steering wheel, blood streaming from wounds on his face and neck. Martinez had stopped firing from the turret, and when Maria looked up, she could see he was unconscious, possibly dead. "Williams is hit," she called into her radio. "Martinez is down. We need immediate backup." Johnson was staring at Williams in shock. His rifle forgotten. The young soldier had trained for this moment. But the reality of combat had overwhelmed him. Maria knew she had to take charge of their situation. Ignoring the pain in her shoulder, she grabbed her medical kit and moved forward to check on Williams. His pulse was weak but steady. And while his wounds were serious, they weren't immediately life-threatening. She applied pressure bandages to the worst cuts and made sure his airway was clear. The gunfire outside was intensifying. Through the radio, she could hear Sergeant Chen trying to coordinate a response. But it was clear that all 3 vehicles in their convoy were pinned down. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site well. There was limited cover available, and the narrow street made it difficult for the convoy to maneuver. "Johnson," Maria snapped, trying to get the young soldier's attention. "I need you to take over Williams's position and get us moving." Johnson looked at her with wide eyes. "I can't drive. I don't know how to operate this thing." "You're going to learn right now," Maria said firmly. "Help me move Williams to the back, then get in that driver's seat. We can't stay here." Together, they managed to pull the wounded Williams into the rear of the vehicle. Maria did what she could to stabilize his wounds, while Johnson climbed into the driver's seat with shaking hands. The radio crackled with desperate voices. The rear vehicle reported that their engine had been hit, and they were immobilized. The lead vehicle was trying to find a way out of the kill zone, but enemy fire was too intense for them to move effectively. Maria made a decision that would change everything. Looking at Johnson, she said, "We're going to have to go help them. Can you get us to the rear vehicle?" Johnson nodded, though his face was still pale. He put the Humvee in gear and began backing up, trying to reach their stranded teammates. As they moved, Maria climbed up into the turret position that Martinez had abandoned. The sight that greeted her was terrifying. The street was filled with smoke and debris. Muzzle flashes came from windows and rooftops in every direction. The rear vehicle, about 50 yards behind them, was surrounded by insurgents who had moved into street-level positions. Maria had been trained on the .50 caliber machine gun, though she had never used it in combat. Her hands found the controls naturally, and she began returning fire at the enemy positions. The big gun bucked in her hands, sending heavy rounds into the buildings where the insurgents were hiding. For a moment, the enemy fire seemed to diminish as the insurgents took cover from her suppressing fire. Johnson managed to maneuver their Humvee closer to the disabled vehicle, and Maria could see soldiers from the rear team preparing to abandon their damaged transport. That's when she saw him. A lone insurgent moving between buildings with an RPG launcher on his shoulder. He was positioning himself for a clear shot at either her vehicle or the disabled one behind them. Without hesitation, Maria swung the machine gun toward his position. She had a clear shot. But as she was about to fire, multiple weapons opened up on her position simultaneously. The insurgents had been waiting for someone to expose themselves in a turret, and now they concentrated their fire on her. The first bullet hit her in the left arm, spinning her partially around but not knocking her down. The second caught her in the right shoulder, and she felt her grip on the machine gun loosen. But she forced herself to stay upright, knowing that the lives of her teammates depended on her providing covering fire. More bullets found their mark. Her left leg, her abdomen, her right arm again. Each impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. But adrenaline kept her conscious and functioning. She managed to fire several more bursts, driving back some of the insurgents and buying precious time for the soldiers from the disabled vehicle to reach safety. The world began to move in slow motion as shock started to set in. Maria could hear Johnson screaming something from below, but his words seemed to come from very far away. She saw the insurgent with the RPG raising his weapon again, this time aiming directly at their Humvee. Using every ounce of strength she had left, Maria swung the machine gun back toward him and fired a long burst. The heavy rounds struck the building where he was positioned, and she saw him fall backward out of sight. But the effort cost her. Several more bullets hit her. In the chest, in her other leg, in her back. As enemy fire came from multiple directions, She finally lost her grip on the machine gun and fell backward into the Humvee. Johnson was beside her immediately, his fear replaced by concern for his wounded medic. Through her fading vision, she could see that soldiers from the rear vehicle had successfully reached their position and were now returning fire from better cover. Maria tried to speak, to tell Johnson how to treat her wounds, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was overwhelming now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She could feel blood soaking through her uniform in multiple places, and her vision was growing dark around the edges. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, and Johnson's voice calling desperately for a medic, not realizing that their medic was the one who needed help most. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as consciousness slowly returned to Maria. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, as if she was floating somewhere above the chaos that continued around her. Through the haze of shock and blood loss, she could hear Johnson's voice, high-pitched with panic, calling for help over the radio. "Medic down. Our medic is down. We need immediate case vac." The irony wasn't lost on her, even in her weakened state. She was the medic, and now she was the one who needed saving. Through sheer force of will, she managed to open her eyes and assess her situation. The view from inside the Humvee was a kaleidoscope of smoke, sparking electronics and worried faces. Specialist Thompson from the rear vehicle had made it to their position and was now applying pressure to what appeared to be the worst of her wounds. His hands were covered in blood, her blood, and she could see the concern in his eyes as he tried to remember his basic medical training. "Talk to me, Rodriguez," Thompson said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Where does it hurt the most?" Maria tried to speak but only managed a weak cough that brought up blood. The metallic taste filled her mouth, and she knew immediately that at least one of the bullets had caused internal damage. She raised a trembling hand and pointed to her medical kit, then made a weak gesture toward her chest. Thompson understood immediately. He grabbed her medical supplies and began following the procedures she had taught him during their training sessions back at the forward operating base. While he worked, Maria tried to take inventory of her injuries. She could feel at least 14 separate impact points where bullets had struck her body. Her left arm was completely numb, likely from nerve damage. Her right leg felt like it was on fire, and she could see bone fragments visible through her torn uniform pants. Blood was pooling beneath her, and despite Thompson's efforts, she knew she was losing the battle against hemorrhage. The firefight outside was beginning to wind down. The arrival of helicopter gunships had shifted the balance decisively in favor of the coalition forces. Through the radio chatter, Maria could hear that the insurgents were withdrawing, leaving behind several of their dead and wounded. Sergeant Chen's voice came over the radio with urgency. "Case vac bird is 2 minutes out. Clear the landing zone. 2 minutes." Maria wasn't sure she had 2 minutes. Her vision was starting to tunnel, and she could feel her heart rate becoming irregular. Thompson was doing his best, but he wasn't a trained medic, and her injuries were beyond what basic first aid could address. Johnson appeared beside her, his young face streaked with tears and dust. "Rodriguez, stay with us. The helicopter's almost here." She wanted to comfort him, to tell him he had done well during his first firefight, but speaking required energy she didn't have. Instead, she managed a weak nod and tried to focus on staying conscious. The sound of the medevac helicopter grew deafening as it landed in a cleared area about 50 yards from their position. The distinctive whoop 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 of the rotors was the most beautiful sound Maria had ever heard. Within seconds, she could hear the voices of the flight medics approaching. Female soldier, multiple gunshot wounds, severe blood loss. Thompson called out as the medics reached their vehicle. "She's been unconscious for about 10 minutes. Came to briefly, but she's fading fast." The flight medics moved with practiced efficiency. Senior Airman Davis, a veteran of dozens of similar extractions, immediately took control of the situation. His partner, Staff Sergeant Kim, began establishing an IV line, while Davis performed a rapid trauma assessment. "I count at least 14 entrance wounds," Davis reported into his headset. "Possible internal bleeding, definite extremity trauma. We need to move now." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Maria felt herself being carefully extracted from the Humvee and placed on a stretcher. The medics worked with incredible speed, starting IV fluids and applying emergency bandages while simultaneously loading her into the helicopter. As the aircraft lifted off, Maria caught a glimpse of the street where the ambush had occurred. Several insurgent bodies were visible among the debris, and she could see her teammates standing beside their damaged vehicles, watching her departure with grave expressions. The flight to the forward surgical team's facility took 12 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Davis and Kim worked constantly during the flight, monitoring her vital signs and administering medications to keep her stable. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness, but she could hear their professional communications, blood pressure dropping. She's going into shock. Type and cross-match for 8 units of blood. Get the trauma surgeon on standby. ETA 3 minutes. Radio ahead. Tell them we have a female soldier. Probable damage to multiple organ systems. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Liberty with a violent bump that sent waves of pain through Maria's battered body. She was immediately wheeled into a medical facility that looked like something between a field hospital and a space station, all gleaming equipment and urgent activity. Major Patricia Williams, the chief trauma surgeon, took one look at Maria's condition and began barking orders to her team. Type O negative blood, 6 units, start it now. Get me 2 large-bore IVs and prep for emergency surgery. What's her name? Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, 82nd Airborne, combat medic. One of the nurses replied. Reading from Maria's dog tags, Major Williams paused for just a moment. She's one of ours, Medical Corps. Let's bring her home, people. The next several hours passed in a haze of anesthesia and surgical procedures. Maria underwent 3 separate operations as the surgical team worked to repair the damage caused by 14 bullets. They removed bullet fragments from her liver, repaired a punctured lung, and reconstructed shattered bone in her right femur. When she finally regained consciousness, Maria found herself in a recovery ward that looked surprisingly modern, considering their location in the middle of a war zone. Sunlight was streaming through a small window, and she could hear the distant sounds of helicopters and military vehicles going about their daily routines. A nurse noticed her stirring and immediately came over to check her vital signs. Welcome back, Sergeant Rodriguez. How are you feeling? Like I've been shot 14 times, Maria managed to whisper, her throat dry and painful. The nurse smiled. That's actually exactly what happened. You've been unconscious for 18 hours. The surgeons did an amazing job. You're going to make a full recovery. Over the next day, Maria learned the full extent of what had happened during and after the ambush. The insurgent attack had been more sophisticated than initially believed, involving more than 20 fighters who had spent weeks preparing their positions. Her actions in manning the machine gun had prevented what could have been a complete disaster for her convoy. Private Johnson visited her that afternoon, looking older and more serious than when she had last seen him. I wanted to thank you, Sergeant. If you hadn't provided that covering fire, we all would have been killed. You did good out there, Johnson, Maria replied weakly. You kept your head when it mattered. Johnson nodded, but she could see the weight of the experience in his eyes. Combat changed people, and she knew he would never be the same teenager who had nervously checked his weapon that morning. As the second day of her recovery progressed, Maria noticed increased activity around the base. Helicopter traffic was heavier than usual, and there seemed to be more urgency in the voices she could hear from the medical staff. Something was happening, but from her position in the recovery ward, she couldn't tell what. That evening, Major Williams stopped by to check on her progress. Your recovery is remarkable, Sergeant. The wounds are healing well, and we should be able to transfer you to Germany within a few days. What's happening out there, ma'am? Maria asked. It seems like something big is going on. Major Williams hesitated for a moment. There's been intelligence about the group responsible for your ambush. Apparently, they've been planning additional attacks on coalition forces. Special operations units are being deployed to deal with the threat. Maria nodded, understanding that she probably wasn't going to get more details than that. Military operations were conducted on a need-to-know basis, and as a patient in a hospital bed, she didn't need to know much. But late that night, she was awakened by the sound of helicopters. Not the familiar sounds of medical evacuations or supply runs, but the distinctive noise of aircraft, designed for stealth and special operations. Through her small window, she could see dark shapes moving across the night sky without lights. Maria had worked with special operations forces before during her deployment. She recognized the sounds and the operational patterns. Somewhere out in the darkness of Fallujah, elite soldiers were moving to complete a mission that was somehow connected to what had happened to her and her team 2 days earlier. As she lay in her hospital bed, listening to the distant sounds of the night mission, Maria thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Her decision to man that machine gun and fight back against the ambush had not only saved her teammates but had apparently provided intelligence that was now being acted upon by some of the most skilled warriors in the American military. The sounds of the helicopters faded into the distance, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts and the steady beeping of the medical monitors that were tracking her recovery. Outside her window, the Iraqi night was filled with the promise of justice being delivered to those who had tried to kill her and her fellow soldiers. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Reaper" Morrison adjusted his night vision goggles and checked his watch. It was 0230 hours, exactly 48 hours since Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been shot 14 times while fighting off an insurgent ambush in downtown Fallujah. Now, Morrison and his SEAL Team 6 unit were about to deliver payback to the terrorists responsible. The intelligence package was comprehensive and damning. Rodriguez's heroic stand at that machine gun had done more than save her teammates. It had provided crucial information that intelligence analysts had been seeking for months. The dead insurgents from the ambush site had been identified, their phone records analyzed, and their network mapped with precision that would have been impossible without the evidence gathered from that bloody street corner. Morrison's team consisted of 8 operators, each a veteran of dozens of similar missions. They had been inserted by helicopter 3 kilometers from their target, and had spent the last 2 hours moving through the darkness toward a compound that intelligence believed housed the leadership of the terrorist cell responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces. Chief Petty Officer Marcus "Bull" Thompson, the team's point man, signaled for a halt as they approached the outer perimeter of the target compound. Through his scope, he could see 2 sentries positioned on the roof of the main building, exactly where the intelligence briefing had predicted they would be. "Reaper, this is Bull," he whispered into his throat mic. "Visual, on 2 sentries, north wall rooftop. No movement on the ground level approaches." Morrison acknowledged and signaled for his sniper team to move into position. Petty Officer First Class Sarah "Ghost" Chen and her spotter, Petty Officer Second Class David "Longshot" Martinez, low-crawled to a position that would give them clear lines of sight to both sentries and the compound's main entrance. The mission had been planned with the methodical precision that characterized all SEAL operations. Intelligence indicated that the compound housed Abu Rashid, a high-value target who had been coordinating insurgent activities throughout the Anbar province. More importantly, Rashid was believed to be the tactical commander who had planned the ambush that nearly killed Rodriguez and her team. "All stations. This is Reaper," Morrison whispered. "Final equipment check. We go in 60 seconds. The team performed last-minute checks of their weapons and equipment. Each operator carried specialized gear for their role in the mission. Morrison had his modified M4 carbine with advanced optics, while the team's breacher, Petty Officer First Class Michael "Demo" Johnson, carried charges designed to silently defeat locked doors and windows. 60 seconds later, Ghost confirmed that both sentries had been neutralized with suppressed sniper fire. The team moved forward in perfect coordination, each operator knowing exactly where to be and what to do without need for radio communication. The compound consisted of 3 buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Intelligence suggested that the target was sleeping in the main building, while his lieutenants occupied the smaller structures. The plan called for simultaneous entry into all 3 buildings to prevent any of the terrorists from escaping or destroying evidence. Morrison led the main assault team toward the primary building, while 2 smaller teams split off to handle the secondary targets. As they approached the main entrance, Demo quickly applied a small explosive charge to the reinforced door, while the others stacked up in preparation for entry. The charge detonated with a muffled thump, and the door swung open. Morrison was through the entrance in less than 2 seconds, his weapon up and ready. Night vision revealed a sparsely furnished room with sleeping mats on the floor, and weapons propped against the walls. A figure stirred in the far corner, a man reaching for an AK-47 that lay beside his sleeping position. Morrison's training took over, and he fired 2 suppressed rounds center mass, dropping the insurgent before he could bring his weapon to bear. "Target down, ground floor clear," he reported quietly into his radio. Bull and the other team members flowed through the building with practiced efficiency, clearing each room in sequence. On the second floor, they encountered more resistance. 3 insurgents had awakened and were attempting to organize a defense when the SEALs reached their position. The firefight was brief but intense. The terrorists were skilled fighters, but they were disoriented from sleep and caught completely off guard by the silent assault. Within 30 seconds, all 3 were neutralized, and the building was secured. "Main building clear," Morrison reported. Beginning search for primary target. In the largest room on the second floor, they found what they were looking for. Abu Rashid was attempting to destroy a laptop computer and several cell phones when Bull burst through the door. The terrorist leader reached for a pistol, but Bull was faster, tackling him to the ground and restraining him with zip ties before he could draw his weapon. "Primary target secured," Bull reported. "Alive and ready for extraction." Meanwhile, the other 2 teams had encountered fierce resistance in the secondary buildings. The sound of suppressed gunfire could be heard throughout the compound as the SEALs worked to eliminate all threats and secure potential intelligence assets. Petty Officer First Class Kevin Torch Williams led the team clearing the eastern building. They discovered a cache of weapons and explosives that included materials consistent with those used in improvised explosive devices found throughout Fallujah. More importantly, they found detailed maps of coalition patrol routes and schedules, intelligence that would have enabled devastating future attacks if it had remained in terrorist hands. The western building yielded an even more significant discovery. Petty Officer Second Class James Prophet Anderson's team uncovered a communications center with radio equipment and computers that had been used to coordinate attacks across the region. Among the electronic intelligence, they found specific references to the ambush that had wounded Rodriguez and killed 2 other coalition soldiers the previous month. "Reaper, this is Prophet," Anderson reported. "We've got the motherlode here. Communications, equipment, planning documents, and what looks like tactical intelligence on coalition operations dating back 6 months," Morrison acknowledged while supervising the restraint and preparation of Abu Rashid for extraction. The terrorist leader was conscious, but appeared to be in shock at how quickly and completely his operation had been compromised. He stared at Morrison with a mixture of fear and disbelief, clearly wondering how American forces had located his carefully hidden compound. "All stations, prepare for extraction," Morrison ordered. "Package is secure, and intelligence harvest is complete." The entire operation had taken less than 15 minutes from initial breach to final room clearing. 7 insurgents were dead. The primary target was captured, and a massive intelligence trove had been secured. Most importantly, the terrorist cell responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces had been completely eliminated. As the team prepared to withdraw from the compound, Morrison took a moment to examine some of the captured documents. Among them, he found photographs and planning materials specifically related to the ambush that had wounded Rodriguez. The level of detail was chilling. The terrorists had spent weeks studying coalition patrol patterns and had specifically chosen their ambush site to maximize casualties. One document in particular caught his attention. It was a hand-drawn map of the ambush site, with notations in Arabic indicating optimal firing positions and escape routes. In the margin, someone had written a note that, when translated, read, "Female soldier in middle vehicle appeared to be medic. Target her first, to prevent treatment of wounded." The realization that Rodriguez had been specifically targeted because of her medical role added an extra layer of significance to the mission. These weren't just random insurgents conducting opportunistic attacks. They were sophisticated fighters who understood coalition tactics and were deliberately trying to maximize the psychological impact of their operations by targeting medics and other support personnel. The extraction helicopters arrived precisely on schedule, their crews having monitored the entire operation from a safe distance. As the SEALs loaded their prisoner and captured intelligence onto the aircraft, Morrison reflected on the chain of events that had made this mission possible. Rodriguez's decision to man that machine gun despite being wounded multiple times had prevented the complete destruction of her convoy. More importantly, her actions had forced the insurgents to fight from their prepared positions rather than executing a quick withdrawal, allowing coalition forces to gather intelligence that would have otherwise been lost. During the helicopter flight back to their forward operating base, Morrison reviewed the initial intelligence reports from the captured materials. The terrorist network was even more extensive than originally believed, with connections to cells operating throughout Iraq and into neighboring countries. The elimination of this particular cell would significantly reduce the threat to coalition forces in the region. As the helicopter touched down at the secure facility where Abu Rashid would begin his interrogation, Morrison thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, lying in her hospital bed just a few miles away. She would probably never know the full impact of her heroic actions during that ambush. But her courage had directly led to the successful completion of one of the most significant special operations missions of the Iraq War. The captured intelligence would prevent dozens of future attacks and save countless lives. The elimination of Abu Rashid's network would force insurgent groups throughout the region to reorganize and rebuild, buying precious time for coalition forces to strengthen their positions and protect Iraqi civilians. Bull approached Morrison as they supervised the unloading of their prisoner and captured materials. "Think she knows what she started?" Morrison shook his head. "Probably not. But that's what makes people like her so dangerous to our enemies. They can't understand someone who would choose to stand and fight when any rational person would run." 3 hours later, as the sun began to rise over Fallujah, Morrison filed his after-action report. The mission had been a complete success by any measure, but he knew that the real hero wasn't any of the elite special operators who had conducted the raid. The real hero was a 26-year-old combat medic from Texas, who had refused to abandon her position even when 14 bullets found their mark. Her courage under fire had set in motion a chain of events that would echo through the intelligence community for months to come and would save lives that she would never even know about. As Morrison finally headed to his quarters for some much-needed rest, he made a mental note to try to visit Rodriguez when she was transferred to Germany for further treatment. He wanted to look her in the eye and tell her that her sacrifice had not been in vain, that her courage had made a difference that would be measured not just in military terms but in human lives saved and futures protected. In the end, that was what the war was really about. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices in impossible circumstances, and the ripple effects of courage echoing through time long after the immediate danger had passed.